The Washington State Department of Ecology released a report outlining how funds from the Cap and Trade program created by the Climate Commitment Act were spent in fiscal year 2024. Here with more on this is the Center Square's Washington reporter, TJ Martinell. TJ, the Center Square has been following the Climate Commitment Act since it passed in 2021. Can you give us the background?
Yeah, so the Climate Commitment Act creates a cap and trade program, and what it does is it sets a maximum threshold for carbon emissions, and emitters who go above it have to participate in a carbon auction where they buy carbon credits. And the price goes up or down based on how much is needed. And then that money from the auction proceeds goes into several accounts that the state accounts, and the legislature gets to decide how to appropriate those funds for projects related to environmental benefits.
Did the Department of Ecology's recent report have to say about how funds from this program are being spent?
Well, they said there's what they said, and then there's the data that's actually in there. And so what they said is that in the fiscal year 2024, $472 million was spent on projects. And I believe they generated, the auctions generated $1.3 billion. And so what was interesting is where the money went. And according to the data provided, out of that 472 million, 53 million, or 11% of that spending was spent on projects that had some form of carbon reduction. So the whole idea for the Climate Commitment Act was to reduce carbon emissions in the state. And so for the projects that's being funded through it, only 11% were spent on carbon reduction.
So what kind of impact did that have on Washington's total carbon emissions or projected carbon emissions?
Yeah, so the amount of carbon reduced, and this is over time, so this is not immediate impact, is 335,000 metric tons, which is, according to the latest figures we have from Ecology, as far as total state emissions are concerned, that's about 0.3% of a percent. So 0.3% of annual emissions was reduced. Now, one person I spoke to about this mentioned that it really, in their opinion, it didn't reduce any carbon because it just took money that could have been spent on something else, and it's a priority thing. So in their mind, no carbon was actually reduced. So that's a source of debate among people who argue over whether or not these projects are effective.
And what kinds of projects did it go to that didn't address emissions?
A lot of them had to do with the fact that there's a clause in the Climate Commitment Act that requires that about 35%, though the goal is 40%, is spent on overburdened communities and areas where there's health disparities. And I believe it was over 60% of funds was spent on those types of projects. And, some of them have to do with improving air quality, reducing air pollution and stuff like that. Though, according to what I read in the report, there's no tracking of how the air quality, how the actual impacts to air quality. So I'm not sure if there's any way of them knowing whether or not the project actually has any benefits in that regard. The other types of projects that they do has to do with, say, public transit, bike lanes, the ones that may have an impact to carbon. I'm not sure necessarily, but EV charging stations. So things like that.
And does the Climate Commitment Act specify at all how much of the funds have to go to reducing carbon emissions? You mentioned that there is a specific clause saying how much have to go to these specific projects for certain communities. Are there any other guidelines on how it has to be spent?
No, that's an interesting and I'd say omission from the state law. There's no requirement. There is a requirement that a certain amount of the revenue goes in. There's a specific state account where the money is to be used for carbon emission reduction, but there's no requirement that a minimum amount of the money spent goes towards reducing carbon. So there's the same spending mandate that we have for, overburdened communities is not there for carbon reduction.
And you reached out to the Department of Ecology asking about this spending. What did they have to say?
They noted that the ecology has no control over how the money is spent. The appropriations are all done by the legislature. So if people have questions about the spending priorities, that's the buck doesn't stop with ecology. It stops with the state legislature. So for people who are looking at this and wondering why there's not more spending on carbon reduction, they should reach out to their local representatives and senators and not complain or ask ecology about it.
Well, TJ, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.